Yeah, so welcome everyone. My talk is going to be about using comparable truth baselines to see if they can help with detecting deception. I saw that one of my co-authors is also here in this session, so that's very nice. Complete. It's about two recent papers we published on this topic. So when it comes to lie detection, I think by now, with all the presentations, you probably know that we're not very good. So we tend to be good liars, but very poor lie detectors. And one of the problems with it is that there are so many individual differences is how we tell a lie, how we tell a story, basically. So we differ a lot in lie telling abilities. For example, people who are fantasy prone tend to provide more details, regardless of whether they're telling the truth or not. Also, people with very good social skills, they tend to get away with their lies more often. They also tend to give more details. So a lot of differences that we need to take into consideration. There is also no cutoff. So most research, basically all of the research in lie detection, it's based on group differences, right? So we make comparisons and we have these rules saying that overall, liars tend to be less detailed than truth tellers. But this cannot be easily translated to single cases, because of course you have this one specific case and you want to make a decision whether this person is telling the truth or not. That doesn't exist. We also have no cutoff score, so we're not really sure what level of detailedness is necessary to make the decision that someone is telling the truth. Also, practitioners would really like to have within subject comparison. So what this means is that they would like to make a decision based on, for example, different statements that that interviewees provide, and then you check whether there are deviations in how detailed they tell the story, for example, that this could help in detecting deception. And this is also the topic of the studies that I conducted. And this is called baselining. So with baselining, what we do is we use a known truthful statement or part of a statement as a comparison to the statement of interest from the same interviewee. So we're basically just comparing, for example, if this person provided two different statements at two different times, you check how much they deviate between these statements to say something about how, whether they're telling the truth, yes or no. In research, so what has been published so far is that we see that there are two different types of baselines that could be used to make a comparison. So on the one hand, we have the small talk baseline. And what this means is that you compare parts of the investigative interview about the crime itself or the act that you're talking about to small talk. So basically, you're just asking them how they're doing about topics that aren't that important for the investigation. But what we know from research is that the behavior is expected to be different regardless of whether someone is telling the truth or not, because it's just it's a very different context, very different stakes, hardly any negative consequences when it comes to small talk. So overall, you would expect a lot of difference because people behave differently when they talk about something that doesn't really matter to them and talk about something that does really matter to them, and they have something to lose. And this is also indeed what studies show, that it doesn't really matter whether you're telling the truth or not, your behavior will be very different from your small talk baseline behavior. So for a baseline to be useful or diagnostic for lie detection purposes, it should be comparable to the statement of interest. So what this means, and I'll try very nicely defined it. He said the baseline that the investigator uses has to be similar in content, context, stake, and both cognitive and emotional involvement to the investigative part, to the investigative questions. And these types of statements, we call those comparable truth baselines. And overall, there's a study from 2018 that did show some support for this idea, because what they did, Nicola Palena and his colleagues, so what they did is they compared truthful and deceptive target statements to either a baseline statement that was based on small talk and a comparable baseline statement. And what they found was that overall, there were more differences between a comparable truth baseline and liars than between a comparable truth baseline and truths. So the verbal behavior between a truth and a truthful baseline was more similar. With small talk, what they found was that it was different, regardless of whether it was the truth or a lie. So that was interesting. And I thought that would be a very good idea to dig into this, to see if a comparable baseline can improve lie detection. So in two-phased experiments, I was actually interested in whether truth tellers would give a target statement that is more comparable in detailedness to the CTB, so the comparable truth baseline, while lie tellers tend to give a less detailed statement in their CTB. So what this means is that overall, when you tell the truth, your target statement will be equally or more detailed than your baseline statement, but when you lie, you tend to go down in detail. So you give less details in your target statement. Another hypothesis that I had was that I expected that a baseline statement will, including this baseline statement or correcting for the language, the detailedness in a baseline statement will actually increase the difference between truth tellers and liars. So that's the second research question I tested. And third, I was interested in not only verbal detailedness and the scoring of the details, whether that showed a difference with baseline, but also whether it would intuitively increase lie detection accuracy. So I expected observers who received such a baseline would achieve overall a higher lie detection accuracy than observers who did not receive such a baseline. So I tested these predictions in two experiments. So in the first experiment, I asked people to talk about autobiographical memory. So I asked them, can you tell me about the time that something very negative happened to you, and as detailed as possible? And then, of course, they had to lie or tell the truth. I did exactly the same in a second experiment, but I showed them a mock crime. So they witnessed a mock crime, and I asked them to tell me about what happened in the mock crime, tell the truth or a lie. So the procedure was very similar in both studies. So I asked people to provide a baseline, which was always the truth. Of course, I had an additional research question that I didn't include in my presentation, but that's the reason why it says under procedure, yes, a baseline and no baseline, because I also had a no baseline group. But for this presentation, I will focus on the group that provided a baseline. Next, I asked them to provide their target statement, which could be either the truth or a lie. And then in the first phase of the experiment, I coded the detailedness of those statements that were provided. And in the second phase of the interview, I showed observers the statements that were gathered during phase one, and I asked them, do you think this person is telling the truth or not? So they had to make veracity judgments on those statements. When it comes to the detailedness, what we did is actually we used a reality monitoring approach. So we had frequency scores for all the details that were present within the statement. So we checked, for example, visual details, auditory, action details, what they did, spatial details, and temporal details. So those are the ones that I focused on. And what I looked at was the sum score of the detailedness of the baseline statement, and then the sum score of the target statement. So the statement of interest, the one that was unclear whether they told the truth or lied. And I thought, well, it would be interesting to check the difference between the two. So what I did is I calculated a difference score that I looked at the deviation in verbal detailedness from the baseline. The idea behind it is when it gives me a negative difference score, it means that the baseline was more detailed. The target statement was more detailed than the baseline. If it was a positive score, it was exactly the other way around. The baseline would be most detailed. The reason I did so is because then I can see whether people tend to provide more details from their baseline or whether they tend to provide fewer details, because my hypothesis was when people lied that they would tend to go down in detailedness. So I checked this, and in experiment 1, what I found was that overall the difference score for truths was a negative score, and for lies, the difference score tend to be more positive. But so it was in the expected direction, but this difference was not significant. In experiment 2, as you can also see, is that the difference was larger between the truths in the baseline and lie in baseline. So what you see here is that indeed, when it comes to a truthful statement, that participants tended to become more detailed. So they provided their baseline, and when they then had to tell the truth, they tend to provide more details in that statement. And when they lied, it was the other way around. They tended to provide fewer details than their baseline. And this was significantly different and also strongly supported by the Bayes factors. So overall, when it comes to hypothesis 1, I found no evidence for baselining in experiment 1, but I did find evidence in experiment 2. Then I was also interested in, can it really improve truth lie detection? So does it increase the difference between truth tellers and liars when we take into consideration this baseline? For the first experiment, I didn't find any evidence. So what I did there is I included the total score, so the detailedness score in the ANOVA. So I just looked at the difference between truths and lies, and then I added the baseline score as a covariate. And what you see here is that the effect size is very similar. In experiment 2, what happened when I added the baseline score as a covariate is that then the difference between truth tellers and liars became significant. But if you check the effect sizes, it's a medium effect. So overall, I find no evidence for improved truth lie detection in experiment 1, but I did find something in experiment 2. This brings me to the second phase of the observers. And what I did here is I either provided the observers with a baseline or not. And I told them also that this is a truthful baseline, and you can compare this to the doubtful statement. Use this as a comparison to make your decision about the veracity. And what I found here is that overall, we had a main difference, so a veracity effect, meaning that overall truths were more accurate than lies. So on the y-axis, you see the accuracy, but the only significant difference was between people who were provided a baseline and no baseline for truths. And contrary to what we expected, when we provided a baseline, they performed actually worse than people who were not provided a baseline. So that was very interesting. In experiment 2, what we found here that when people were provided a baseline, they had a higher accuracy when it came to detecting lies, not truths. So this was very different from experiment 1. For this experiment, we then also checked the sensitivity. So we checked sensitivity and response bias. So we investigated like what did they do? And the difference between getting a baseline yes or no was apparently because in the no baseline group, people performed significantly worse than chance. So that was also interesting. For the response bias, what we see is that there was a bias towards responding truths for the no baseline and the target statement. But this didn't happen anymore for the people who were provided a baseline statement. So overall, this makes me conclude that people just tend to be more critical when they get a baseline. And it doesn't really improve lie detection when it comes to intuitive judgments, but it does make them more critical. So looking at the hypothesis I had for experiment 1, there was hardly any evidence for baselining. But in experiment 2, we did see that it seems to have some merit, but not really for intuitive judgments. So that is interesting. So overall, the conclusion, based on my experience with regards to using baseline, is that it seems to be a promising addition to existing lie detection tools, but currently it doesn't seem to improve lay people's intuitive judgments. And this is also how I want to end my presentation. So I'll